Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and I'll be teaching a lesson today on the 6th chapter of Proverbs. The daily reading of Proverbs is a practice I've indulged in the past 3 years. There are 31 chapters in that book, which more days of the month have that many days in them. So it makes sense that whatever day of the week it is, or day of the month it is, that you read from that chapter. And the beauty of it is that you notice new things in each time. New phrases hit you in new waves. You discern new emphases. And now the sixth proverb isn't my all-time favorite, but it being the middle of the month, since I've renewed my schedule once more, it's really I've extracted the most teachable material from it, which I'll attempt to expound on in the allotted time format. Now, normally what I would do is that it's a practice I encourage among all those who I teach, whatever level they are, beginner, intermediate, advanced. It's a practice all of us can benefit from. Now, there are 35 verses in the 6th chapter. What I would do is divide however many people were in the group in divisions of 5. But because it is a monologue form, I'll be addressing the narrative divisions by theme rather than numerically. So the first theme I'll address, section I'll address is verses 1 through 3. It opens with "My son." This is significant because the opening of the previous and subsequent chapter also start with the some phrase, and in chapter 1 verse 8 we first read of "my son," meaning that Solomon directed the book as a guide to his son. It's questionable to what extent he was writing with posterity in mind. He was also explicitly giving advice to son on how to be a right ruler, but a lot of the advice he gives is applicable to non-royal rulers for daily life. And the summary of the subsequent 3 verses is that it is dangerous to engage in business with trusted friends and untrusted strangers for opposite reasons. Friends and money are oil and water mix. A lot of times they have the trust and betray the trust, and strangers are rarely trustworthy to begin with. Verses 4 through 11 pick up on 2 themes really in one. One is a recipe for poverty, which is connected to laziness. Proverbs offers the contrast between the diligent. A lot of it is antithetical, meaning that it contrasts 2 ways of way: the lazy, the diligent, the foolish, the wise, the wicked, the righteous, and it gives that laziness is a recipe for poverty. And verses 5 through 6 contain animalistic analogies, and this is indicative of Solomon, who was a well-noted polymath, who, among other things, was a zoologist and biologist. You can read of his exploits in 1 Kings 4:33. He was quite the accomplished man in that field, a pioneer in his day, and he was able to observe lessons from the animal kingdom and apply them to human moral lessons. Verses 12 through 15 describe basically a wicked person. For lack of a better words, he employs a series of adjectives. Basically, a bad person. It describes his motives, his actions, his attitudes, and verse 15 is his consequences, his ends. So the moral of the story in a nutshell is that crime doesn't pay. verses 16 through 19 lists 6 things that the Lord hates. And this is important because a lot of modern Christians shrink away from the notion of a God that could hate everything. They depict him as a God of all love, but the fact is that he's more multifaceted than that. He never hates anyone, but he does hate certain things. And at this point, I would reference a book that I wrote, Who is My Neighbor? An extensive commentary on the Good Samaritan parable, which on the chapter of the priest and Levite, the intricacies of the plot development are beyond the range of time, but I comment on a relevant excerpt, which I will read. We already know that we are to be as loving as possible and as often as possible, and not for our sakes alone are we to be, as we have heard, if possible, on thy part, be at peace with all men. Romans 12:18. But are the Father's followers ever permitted to hate anything? We are never to hate anyone, but it is sometimes necessary and righteous to hate some things, including evil in general, Psalms 97:10, and bribes in particular, Exodus 18:21. We are to hate false doctrines and deeds, Revelation 2:6, 14, and 15, and to align our hatreds with the things that the Father hates, Proverbs 16 through 19, the passage we just referenced, and Psalm 139, 21, 22. We must never hate evil people, only the evil it is that they do. We must also hate it when people are oppressed, when children are sick and starving, and when Yahweh is dishonored. Only in a perfect world would it be possible to be at peace with all men at all times. Verses 20 through 23 references my son again, and preaches on the efficacy of maintaining the law, father's commandments, and laws of the mothers are the terms in verse 20, and bind them continually upon thine heart. That means makes them an integral part of you, make it very part of your essence and your being, so much so that it defines your every action and attitude. And when thou go, it shall leadest thee, it shall guide you. And verse 23, for the commandment is a lamp and the law is light. And this parallels with Psalm 119 verses 105, which makes a similar analogy to the law as a light which guides one in darkness. Verses 24 through 35 describe the main character of it is an adulteress, and he describes the seductive appeal of her and issues warning and consequences of not heeding to that warning, and asks a series of rhetorical questions in verses 27 through 28. And he also references another breed of sinner in verses 30 and 31, the thief, and then returns to the adulterers in verse 32. And verse 33, he closes with a wound and dishonor shall he get as a consequences, and his reproach shall not be wiped away, indicative of a permanent effect to be avoided at all cost. And then he describes the reaction of the guilty culprit's husband, who has little reason to forgive. I know that as Christians we're taught to forgive, but we should, in a certain sense, it's foolhardy to expect forgiveness from those we've wronged, especially those who do not share the beliefs. Now that, there's a wealth of thoughts in Proverbs 6, not all of them related, but all of them relevant and all of them necessary and all of them practical. and all of them worth expounding and learning on. And thank you. That concludes the lesson. Bye bye.